I would like to take the time to introduce you to the kingdom of Wakanda. Now, I'm being sarcastic, but I have this up here for a reason before we go on. When when Black Panther came out, and you probably must be living under a rock if you haven't at least heard of Black Panther or the kingdom of Wakanda. When Black Panther came out, Black America was so proud because we had a fantasy film. I don't think we've ever had a fantasy film that represented us so well. You had a man that wasn't born from humble beginnings, but he was humble. He was a prince who ascended to a king. And you had a mythical, majestical city based on science that was the most advanced in the world. Now, some white America, and I read, all this backlash because they thought Black Americans were silly for having this adoration about Wakanda. And I think in part of their mind is because Africa is always portrayed as this broke down third world nation, which if you know anything about Africa and some of these countries, that's not the case, but that is the perception. So when this came out and I was reading all of this hate about Wakanda and I thought to myself, man, we can't even have a fantasy film to our own self. So the reason I brought this up is because I want to introduce you to the real life Wakanda, the Greenwood District edition in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was renowned. It was affluent. It had many businesses, Black-owned business. It was so affluent, it was called Black Wall Street. It was supposed to be supposedly the richest Black town west of the Mississippi. It had Black newspapers, 2 of them, hotels, restaurants, furriers. Do you know what a furrier is? Furrier is kind of like Whole Foods. They don't put furriers in broke down places. And they had a taxi service. And they had 23 churches. Greenwood, all of this existed in Greenwood. It had a library branch, a high school that taught Latin, chemistry, and physics. And, with everything, it had gambling, prostitution, and drugs. And you really don't hold that against it because you laugh, but up until 1910 and in most of the major cities, prostitution was legal. And as Erik stated before, because of the Mann Act, prostitution basically was made illegal. And the Mann Act entrapped a number of Black men, including Chuck Berry, who had a little R. Kelly thing about, white women, but that's a whole totally different subject.
Totally.
But just like the fantasy Wakanda, the real life Wakanda, Greenwood District had its detractors, it had its haters. The white populace was jealous and they really were envious of a lot of things that were going on in Greenwood. They called it Little Africa in the pejorative sense, in Nigger Town. What I'm going to do right now is I have a rare vintage video. Well, it must not have been that rare. I was able to find it on YouTube, but it is in color. And before we proceed, the reason I want to go ahead and show this is some of the pictures I have of the devastation afterwards. They're in black and white, not a lot of detail, but when you see this, you'll see and kind of recognize part of the devastation. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this.
Some African-American communities are prospering, like the residents of Greenwood, a suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Here, former slaves were given land after the Civil War, and this rare footage shows the thriving town they built. A remarkable Baptist pastor named Solomon Sir Jones is the pioneering filmmaker. His footage was lost for more than 50 years. Jones captures the bustling life of Greenwood, which could be any American small town. But Tulsa's whites don't like what they see. In May 1921, after a black man is accused of assaulting a white woman, a white mob rampages through the city. For a night and a day, they loot and burn Greenwood. The Fox News crew captures the only surviving footage. It is the bloodiest racial massacre in American history, leaving nearly 300 dead.
Now, we're about to get to what started all this in just a second. I did find a newspaper article, and you can't really tell the words from it over here, but I did type the words and put it so you can read it. And I'm going to come back to that. But the Tulsa Race Riot lasted from May 31st, and excuse me, I'm skipping 1919, the Red Summer of 1919, to go to the Tulsa Race Riot to discuss that first, because most people are more familiar with the Tulsa Race Riot than they are the Elaine Race Massacre. So I apologize for not prefacing you that. Okay, so essentially what happened in this case, and this is one of the most silliest occurrences of something like this starting. You had a 19-year-old courier named Dick Rowland, who, and I've heard different versions, I've read different versions, and I'll have to update my book now that I got an actual clip. But I've been told that Dick Rowland was a black shoe shine person, that he was a courier, and I've also been told that he was a black shoe shine guy who was running an errand trying to drop off a package for that day. Regardless of what happened, certain facts are known. Mr. Rowland was in the Drexel building one morning, and he entered the elevator with a white female operator named Sarah Page, who was a 17-year-old divorcee. Yes, she was a divorcee. She was, according to the article, I just had that she was paying her way through school, but she had taken the position to pay her way through business college. And for those young folks who are looking at the broadcast, elevators back in the day used to be operated mostly manually. And it was partly because the technology was not in place for it to automatically happen on its own, and also as a customer service thing. If you have a business, you own a building, and you have somebody, a host or hostess in the elevator, when somebody comes in, you're talking to them, hey, how you doing, boom, boom, boom. And you kind of greet them, hey, how's your day? What floor are you going to, sir? What floor are you going to, ma'am? They tell you, you talk to them, and brighten up their day. In this case, Mr. Rowland bumped or touched Sarah Page. She screamed. When the doors opened, he did what any normal black man would do. He ran. Now, I know some people would say, well, if he was truly innocent, why come he didn't stay there? Well, historically, that's never really ended well for young black men. So he went ahead, he ran, and he was good. He was digging too. They caught him a couple of hours later. Now, this woman, if you go back and read, she says that she had scratches and stuff. Her skirt had been torn and all this, and this assault. However, when they questioned her later, they found near scratch, and they found near tore clothing. So what probably happened now, Rowland admitted to touching her. Now, I don't know in which way he touched her, it was a mistake or whatever, but when she screamed, he knew he was supposed to run. You did not touch, a black man did not touch a white woman. Now, Tulsa's not necessarily in the South, but it's far enough to the South, he knew he needed to get digging. Now, what happened was, the next day, the paper reported this story. And by the time all these white people started reading this story, they started getting mad. Now, by this time, they had kind of determined that Roland was basically kind of innocent, but things had started, people had jumped up and they were starting to collect outside the building. So about 7:30, a group of 500, about 500 whites were outside. They had moved Roland from the city jail to the county jail because they thought they could best protect him there. Okay. Well, you had about 500 whites in the mob outside, and they were calling for Roland to be taken out of the jail so they could lynch him. So 25 black men came and offered their services to the sheriff. The sheriff turned them down, told them to leave. When the whites heard about the blacks offering their services, they became mad. So they went and they got some more people. So about 10 o'clock, about 10,000, about 2,000, a mob of about 2,000 whites gathered around outside the county jail. 75 black men returned this time. Some of them, they were armed. Some of them were World War I vets, I believe, who had fought with the Harlem Hellfighters and the 369th Infantry. And they formed a buffer between the jail and the crowd. Now the sheriff was trying to get the black men to leave. One of the white crowd questioned one of the black veterans' right to have his gun there. They tussled. The gun went off. And as they said, all hell broke loose. Now, I'm going to read you what I have in my book about what happened, and then we're going to go ahead and Stafford to chime in. Over the next 6 hours, Tulsa was plunged into chaos as angry whites, frustrated over the failed lynching, began to vent their rage at African Americans in general. Furious fighting erupted along the Frisco Railroad tracks, where black defenders were able to hold off members of the white mob. An unarmed African American man was murdered inside a downtown movie theater, while carloads of armed whites began making drive-by shootings in black residential neighborhoods. By midnight, fires had been set along the edge of the African American Community Commercial District. In some of the city's all-night cafes, whites began to organize for a dawn invasion of Greenwood. Further, as Scott Elwood writes, Tulsa police officers deputized former members of the lynch mob and, according to eyewitnesses, instruct them to get a gun and go get a nigger.
Wow. Which, once again, no regard for Black life. And that's going all the way back to Dred Scott. And here we are 70 years after Dred Scott. So just imagine the, what was custom back then. This went on for 70 years, and this is right after the end of World War I, right after the Red Summer, where no one was prosecuted pretty much for all the destruction of Black life that took place during the Red Summer. And so, and we had also mentioned that they had just, and I can't recall, did we talk about the fact that not too long ago, right before this had happened, they had drug a white man out of jail?
Well, yeah, no, we didn't talk about that. So that's another thing. Tulsa had a bit of a reputation, and I forgot to preface you guys with that. Tulsa had a bit of a reputation as being kind of a corrupt town at that point in time because it was an oil town. And so it grew real quick. And it had a lot of millionaires, but it had a lot of corruption. And so at one point in time, prior to this, the white mob had drugged a white young man. I forgot what his transgression what he had done, but they had drugged him out of the jail, and basically, I believe they lynched him.
Right.
And as the crowd was trying to get to view this, the police were directing traffic so they could view it. So if they would do that to a white man several years prior to this going down, you know what was going to happen to Black people. Now, this particular picture I kind of questioned when I ripped it off. I found out that, I mean, I didn't mean rip it off. I mean, when I ripped it from the site, you guys know what I'm talking about.
We know.
When I ripped it off, I went back and looked. This is somebody's house was here, and it's no longer here. And so they are residing in this teepee because it's temporary shelter. That's what they have.
Wow.
This is a picture of a black man. Obviously, he's dead, and it seems to be some sort of, I don't know what's going on in the background here. These people running toward the chaos. And of course, you see this right here. Now, some of you who are familiar with Lovecraft, if you've seen this season's Lovecraft, they featured the Tulsa Race Riot in this, and you might remember that Journey Smollett, who portrayed, I believe, Letitia, she had the book in her arm, and she was walking back to the building, and as she was walking back, planes were flying over and they were dropping bombs. Well, they weren't actual bombs, but there were reports that whites used planes and they dropped incendiary devices filled with turpentine and coal oil down on the populace below. And I don't know if you know anything about turpentine, but when you light it and you throw it on something, it's going to burn until it's burned all the way down. So you see this devastation. There were reports that white mobs had a machine gun mounted on the back of a truck, and they were just going into neighborhoods indiscriminately, just shooting. I can't really explain the horror that went on and really the disrespect. Now, the National Guard was called out and they came out, but as I reported in my book, the first order of business that they took upon when they arrived in Tulsa was they made preparations to get breakfast before they decided to do anything. Now,
wow. To eat.
Compounding matters was the fact that whites had developed this rumor that blacks were going to strike at them. So they were trying to kind of cover up what actually started the whole incident. Now, after all of this, you had some blacks, which I would say they were placed in concentration camps. They were detained for a number of days. The aftermath of the Tulsa Race Riot, it's approximately over 1,000 buildings and homes were destroyed. Over 9,000 black people were left homeless. And everything that I talked about, Wakanda, was gone. Wakanda Greenwood edition was gone. 35 city blocks were destroyed by fire or other means. You literally had people who were breaking into ammo shops, and they were given guns, and they were being deputized by the sheriff, and they were told to go to get a gun and to go get a nigger. Now, property loss as far as money, $2 to $3 million back then, 26 to 39 million now. The death toll, and this is really kind of interesting. The city's official death toll was 36. Now the Red Cross estimated it to be a little bit over 300. And I tend to believe the Red Cross because they're the ones, the first responders, the one on the ground, they're the one, bandaging the people up, one helping to bury the people. The only good, I guess if you say good news from all of this, was that despite the efforts of a bunch of white landowners to come in and scoop up the property, a group of black lawyers got together and they actually protected most of the land, and it got placed back in the hands of the black populace. But I went to school, I got my master's at Langston University in Langston, Oklahoma. I can tell you now, I visited, well, this was like in 1988, 1990, something like that. I went to visit Tulsa, somebody took me around and we were driving around And I was waiting for them to tell me, well, this is the place. So we're driving around. I'm like, well, where is this place? And she said, well, this is it. And I was like, this is kind of raggedy. I mean, it wasn't being funny. I'd heard all the stuff about Greenwood. So I was expecting the place really never, ever recovered. Now, Mr. Stafford had told me a story about somebody, a family or a gentleman who had recovered. He had gone, he'd gone on to recover. But
you remember Neil? You remember Neil Campbell from
yeah,
our?
yeah.
So it was actually Neil's great grandfather.
Oh, okay.
His name was Morris Neely, and he owned a pool hall on Greenwood. And after the riots, he was able to not necessarily restore his business, but he was able to continue his business. And he was able to send two of his daughters to Howard University. So that is a testimony of Black resiliency and just being able to, just being resilient. And because that was all he had. So he had to make it work. So he was a true entrepreneur, very resourceful, but he was able to send his two daughters to Howard University, and they graduated.
Well, as with everything back then, the Black residents are the one who received the blame. And this is a quote that was taken from the mayor of Tulsa, in the Tulsa World, 1921. And you guys can read for yourself what he said. The thing I find very interesting, and this is the reason why I put as the underlying cause of the riot was jealousy. If you look at his second sentence, it says, it is the judgment of many wise heads. I don't know who's wise heads, but wise heads in Tulsa, based upon observation of a number of years, that this uprising was inevitable. So basically he's saying this was bound to come to pass. We knew there was going to be a riot. So then I'm wondering to myself, well, if you said this, so this means you was waiting for an excuse. Then if we look at the rest of his statement, he basically says, we knew a riot was coming and we are glad that it happened where in Greenwood, because those are the people responsible for this. We're not taking any responsibility. And so we wipe our hands of it. And that's basically how I take this statement. And this is what the mayor had said. Interestingly enough, when I was at Langston University and I found out about this, the Tulsa Race Riot, I started talking to a lot of the students on campus who were from Tulsa. And I was asking them, because I had never heard of this. And I was surprised that at that time, most of them had not heard of it. But now, as I understand, I should not have been that surprised. There was a concerted effort by the white press to destroy a lot of the newspapers at that time, because it was almost as if it was a taboo subject. It was like they were ashamed of it. But I think now a lot more people understand what went down. But at that time, it really was not discussed, and obviously not taught too much in Tulsa schools.